Okie dokie. So, welcome to part two, and we're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. I want to break this out into its own section. The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents that has ever been created. I would argue that of all the many things that the United States has done in its history, the Declaration of Independence will probably be remembered as our most important accomplishment to humanity. It spells out in a principled philosophical stance the proper relationship between a people and their government. This has become the model for modern governments around the world and for our understanding of what government is and what government means. And so I wanted to break this out and make a video covering it separately because it really is important. I want to spend a little bit of time with it. Normally in class, I show that funny video of TV stars from the 90s, George Clooney and others, reading through it, and the students get a kick out of it. Then we break it down and talk about it. Obviously, it's a little bit more difficult in this relationship. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, I've pulled up on my screen, this is from the government archives, the language of it. I'm going to read some excerpts from it. I want you to go and find your copy. It's going to be in your textbook. You can find it online. And I want you to follow along with me. And I want you to take some time to think about the words, not just as words or poetry, but what they mean. Okay? So this is the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. So what is that saying? Let's start there. What is that first clause saying? Well, it's setting the context. What is this all about? It's saying at some point it becomes necessary for someone to be independent. Moving on, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. So it's saying we're going to declare our independence so that we can become another nation. Now this is important because they're looking out at this community of nations and they're saying, you are all independent. We want to be like you. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And what that's saying is, when you declare your independence, you should tell the world why. What is it that makes it impossible for us to remain part of this group that we already are a part of? Now this is important. Now think for a second. Who is this written to? Now this is the Declaration of Independence, so they're declaring their independence from the British, right? But who is this written to? Do they, at this point, actually expect King George to go, oh, sure, yeah, you want to be independent, go for it. I didn't understand. No, of course not. What they're saying is, hey, France, hey, Spain, hey, other countries in the world, we are becoming independent. This is why we want you to recognize us. Now, this is fundamentally important, and we see this in the Revolutionary War. The U.S., the colonies, don't have the strength to defeat the English crown. They don't have the troops. But what they need is foreign support to do so, particularly French support. And so this is a message not just to the English, not just to the crown, not just to their own citizens, but it's really a message to the French and to other nations saying, this is what we're doing and why we need your support. So moving on. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now think about that for a second. Stop there. So in the English model, we talked about the divine right of kings. The English model of government was very much the divine right of kings, right? And so where did they believe that rights came from? Well, they came from God, but they came to the king, the absolute monarch. Now, what we're saying here is that we as a nation believe that those rights didn't just go to King George to then be distributed as he saw fit, but that each and every citizen of the country, each and every man, in the word they chose at the time, has those rights independently given to them from God. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that if God gives them the rights, then no power can justly take those rights away from them. Correct? If God gave it to us, no one has the power to take it away justly. What rights? Well, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Originally, life, liberty, and property, but there were some issues with the belief that the government might have to take property under certain circumstances, so they changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now here's a big one. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Think about that for a second. What is the purpose of government? Is it to be in charge? Is it to defeat the French? Is it to, as people would have thought at the time, to glorify the king and serve the king? No, it is to protect the rights of its citizens. The entire purpose that government exists for is to secure the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of its people. That's it. Full stop. Governments are created for that purpose. Deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Okay, now we're getting crazy. Where does the power that the government has come from? Now, people have power from God. That's what it set up at the first part of this paragraph up here. Right? People have power from God. But governments have power from the people. Now, this is the exact opposite. This is the exact opposite of what many people in English society believed at the time. This is the exact opposite of what the king would believe, right? He would believe that God gave him power and that people existed to serve him. But these colonials, they're saying that God gave the people power and that government only exists to serve the people. Moving on, it says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organization and organizing its power in such forms as to them shall be seen most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what he's saying is, and this is something we're fighting about throughout U.S. history, is the right of the people to overthrow their government. To say, the government has failed us, they have failed in their obligations to secure our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and so it is our right, indeed our duty as citizens, to overthrow that government and to create a new one. Amazing. Amazing. Moving on. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. That accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the form of government to which they are accustomed. What they're saying there is that if you look at human history, most of the time we're not going to throw off the government, even if the government fails to do its job. Most of the time we're just going to suffer through it because it's scary to make changes. It's hard to make changes. And so most of the time we'll just suffer. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing inevitably the same objective, evidences a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. It gives you tingles, right? I know, maybe I'm a bigger nerd than most of you listening to this, but it gives you tingles. He's saying, it is our duty when the government fails to throw it out and make it better. Now remember, what we're dealing with here is, at the time this was written, they were having some issues with the crown, but most people still wanted to be English. But we were dealing with a time period where the best it had ever been in history was to be a subject of the British crown. That was the most free, the wealthiest, the most peaceful anyone in history had ever been. And they looked at that and they said, it's not good enough. Because the government has to secure our rights to life, liberty, and property, and this government is failing to do so. So after that, it goes on. It talks about the history. It talks about, list out all of these things that they're saying that the British Crown, the King of England, has done wrong. And it ultimately ends with saying that they declare that they are and of right ought to be free and independent states. But it's really this first part that I want to focus on because it's so full of amazing imagery of language that really speaks to us today. And most of this language came from John Locke. It came from this political philosopher of the time that had many of the fundamental ideas that we still have today. For example, popular sovereignty. We talked about that last time. The right to govern comes from the consent of those being governed. The people are king. Social contract theory, the idea that people give up some of their rights to live in a society so they can protect other rights. The idea that government should protect property rights, preserve rights, life and liberty. That citizens can remove rulers who do not serve those purposes. And that government exists solely for the good of its subjects and not for the benefit of those who govern. Now, this is when I like to take a second, pull it back, and ask you a question. Is he right? Or is he just, were our founding fathers just a bunch of crazy, long-haired hippies smoking hemp? Because think about the government we have today. Are we living up to the standards set by the Declaration of Independence? Is the government's sole purpose to secure the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of its citizens, or has it taken on new purposes, lesser purposes? Does it exist for your good, or does it exist for its own good and the good of those who have more power? One story I like to kind of, near the end of this lecture, I like to talk about is the story of Rip Van Winkle. This is a Washington Irving short story. And it's a very interesting one. There's actually a Wishbone, if you're familiar with that children's series that you can watch that goes through the story with Wishbone as the main character. And I encourage you to do it. It's kind of fun. But it's an interesting story because what happens is there's a man, he lives in the colonies at the time. He's important for the story, married to a woman he really doesn't like. And so most of the time what he does is he goes out and goes hunting to get away from his wife. And so he likes to go out, go to his favorite bar, the King George Inn, get a drink, and then wander up into the woods with his trusty dog to go hunting. So he wanders up into the woods one day, a good colonist. He wanders up into the woods. He finds a bunch of old people bowling. It turns out they're actually the ghost of old settlers or gods or something like that. And he drinks some of their beer, and he goes and sits down to take a nap under the tree. He wakes up, and he has a long white beard, and his trusty dog, who had been sitting next to him before, is gone and has been replaced with the skeleton of a dog. So he gets up, and he wanders down the hill, and he goes to his favorite bar, not noticing that it is no longer the good King George, but the George Washington Inn. He walks in, and everybody stops and looks at him and goes, "Are you a Kingsman or a patriot?" And he goes, "Well, I'm a good Kingsman," because at the time he was, and they're about to kill him. And then a woman shows up and says, "Stop." And then she realizes that this is her father, who had gone up into the woods 20 years ago, drinking the beer of the gods, fallen asleep under a tree, woken up 20 years later, and didn't understand what had changed. And so they explained to him the long horrors that the British Crown had visited on, and he agrees that the king was wrong, and he supports the patriots, of course, because that's sort of the moral of the story. He's also very happy to learn that his wife, who had been nagging him for years, is now dead. Again, a different time, funny story, but and that's the story of it. But why do I include this? Why do I mention this here? Well, because we just talked about all this, and for many of you who are used to American history, all of this was something that you probably knew. You don't really think about. You grow up hearing these stories. But what I like about Rip Van Winkle is it highlights something that we don't normally think about, which is how quickly all of this happened. In a span of 20 years, we went from the people who lived in the colonies were proud British subjects. George Washington was an officer in the British Army, right? 20 years later, we are an open, armed rebellion against them and winning our freedom. And just that quickly, that blink of an eye, quite literally for Rip Van Winkle, this blink of an eye, it completely changed our government and our relationship. So we ended up, of course, going to war. The British weren't that happy with the Declaration of Independence. We needed to establish how the governments would interact. And so in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were created. Basically, the different states got together and created what's been referred to as a League of Friendship between 13 sovereigns. Basically, imagine France, England, Germany, Spain, etc., coming together and setting up a loose framework for how their government could function. The idea was that everyone remains independent, everyone, all of the states, all of the colonies remain sovereign, but that we have this shared system to make sure that we can field an army and resolve disputes between the states. Now, this document was good enough to see us through the war, but after the war, we started to see problems with it. There were a lot of problems with the Articles of Confederation. There was no real executive branch. The powers all stayed with Congress. Not really a judicial branch. The state courts controlled. Each state had veto powers over any changes to the Articles of Confederation. So if one state didn't like something new we were trying to do in the Articles of Confederation, they could stop it. It took 19 of 13 states to approve any legislation. So even if you were making a law under the Articles of Confederation, you had to have 19 of the 13 states agree to it. Only states had the power to tax. The central federal government could ask the states to tax. They could borrow from foreign powers, or they could sell Western lands, and beyond that, they didn't have the power to raise money. Congress couldn't raise money, raise soldiers, and Congress couldn't regulate trade. And so it was a very, very, very weak form of central government. And problems quickly arose. One of the most famous was Shays' Rebellion. So after the Revolutionary War, there was a recession in the United States. So a lot of farmers had taken out mortgages, bank loans, secured by their farms. And when the economy went down, all of a sudden the banks tried to foreclose, tried to take those farms to pay off the debts. This became additionally a bigger problem because at the time many of the states believed that the only people who should be allowed to vote are people who had owned enough property to be important enough to have an opinion. So this meant that not only if you lost your farm did you lose your livelihood, but you lost any say in the government. So it was a very big deal. So as these evictions started coming forward, Daniel Shay, former Army captain, grabbed 1,500 men, and they went and got a bunch of weapons from the arsenal, and then they went and stood in front of the courthouse. The idea was that if you couldn't hold a court proceeding, you couldn't foreclose on someone's farm. So if they didn't let anyone into the courthouses, then there would be no more foreclosures and people would be allowed to keep their farms and their livelihoods. This was a problem for the banks. And so the state governments reached out and said, hey, we need troops to drive this armed rebellion out. And the U.S. Congress said, well, we don't have any money, we can't raise troops. So what we're going to do is say, hey, other states, we need you to raise money. And the other states said, well, this isn't affecting us, so no, we're not giving you any money. And so what happened was the states and the central government were completely unable to put down this rebellion. Ultimately, the banks went out and had to hire private troops to come and put the rebellion down. But this showed a fundamental failure. Unless something directly affected a state, the state wasn't willing to contribute anything towards the well-being of its fellow states. And so very quickly, we saw that there was a problem with the Articles of Confederation. And on February 21st, 1787, there was a constitutional convention called in Philadelphia. The idea was that they would sit down and revise these Articles of Confederation to meet some of these problems. Ultimately, instead, they ended up throwing out the Articles of Confederation altogether and creating a brand new government that still lasts to this day. Okay, that's the end of part 2. We'll start part 3 in a little while.